Welcome to Liberty in America, Past, Present, and Future with Dr. Bill Chobe. Doc is a historian and a reenactor. On this show, you'll hear his thoughts about our personal liberties from their earliest recorded beginnings. You'll also be transported back to the 1750s to relive the life of Colonel George Washington and his adventures during the French and Indian War. Let's get started. Here's Dr. Bill Chobe.
Okay, here we go. Dr. Bill Chobe. We had a discussion about liberty in America, past, present, and future. Today is number 4 in that series. We're talking about the challenges in the Middle Ages. If you recall, after the end of our last podcast, we talked about the fall of the Roman Empire and how it had overextended itself. There was moral degradation, lots of debt, and essentially social collapse. Accordingly, you may remember at that time that Nero, while he was fiddling and watched Rome burn, that he blamed it on the only part of town that was not burning, that was inhabited by Christians, and it led to lots of persecution as a result. If you also remember, this was the same man who said that in order to keep the populace quiet, you give them bread and circus, in other words, food and entertainment, and not unlike we see happening today in our country. But in the Middle Ages, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the various areas, provinces, if you will, became countries that were headed by kings and queens, and they developed a feudal system. This is one where they would grant land to bishops and barons, and then exchange for a regular supply of soldiers and food and taxes. And these noblemen, they subdivided their lands to lords of the land, who then leased it to peasants who worked for them. So there was sort of a hierarchy that was based upon pretty much by force, because the peasants had very few property or individual rights, and they were required to pay homage to the lords of the land in exchange for their protection, supposedly, and for the opportunity to eke out a living from the small plots of land. So here's an example when might is right, the people grown in bondage. Now, mind you that the medieval global warming period began at the year around 800 AD and lasted for about 400 years. And it made for a very productive climate for growing crops and generally increased the number of people and animals for that reason. The foods that they ate were basically grown above the ground with beans and barley, nuts, herbs, rice, wheat, etc., but grains. And these were vulnerable to adverse weather and to invading armies. So what it really boiled down to is that the peasants had very little for themselves, and they were very prone to malnutrition and infectious communicable diseases because of the way they lived. But the uncertain food supplies would also cause major political conflicts. And when that happened, of course, then the peasants had to pay the price for it. And in essence, the peasants had very little personal individual freedom. It was basically survival of the fittest in a brutish short life, with very primitive living conditions and constant wars with the king's enemies. But throughout this time, they developed another hierarchy of influence, and that was the religious leaders. And so because they were influenced beyond the political boundaries, they developed quite a following. Now, of that time, there were 3 main divisions of the primary religion of Judaism. And we recall there was a patriarch, Abraham, who could not have a son through Sarah, so he then took the aid of Hagar, and she had a son to Abraham by the name of Ishmael, but he wasn't the promised one. So when Sarah did conceive with Isaac, then Ishmael was sort of cast out into darkness. So with with Isaac, that was the lineage of the Jewish people, and Ishmael was the lineage of the Arabs or the Muslims, as we know them today. Christianity, of course, we know came as a result of the lineage of Judaism later on through the introduction of that sense of covenant through Jesus Christ. So the people were suffering in the chaos of all of this, and of course the battles between the Arabs or the Muslims, the descendants of Ishmael versus the descendants of Isaac, and Christians over the Holy Land. There was back and forth crusades by Christians out of Europe to try to take the lands back from Jerusalem, in Jerusalem. So armies would be raised by the different kings that would go and attempt to do this. But there was mixed results with that. So early in the 12th century or so, there were several soldiers that were elite, considered elite soldiers. There were 9 of them that they organized to try to liberate the Holy Lands from the Arabs. And they called themselves the Poor Knights of the Temple Mount. And this was about the Temple of King Solomon. And that they began a process that eventually turned into the Knights Templar. The Templars were monastic warriors who would give up their own personal property to take on the holy vows of a monk and the sword of an army. And because they were pretty much limited in their jurisdiction, eventually Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull making them a bona fide monastic order, and therefore they were able to operate across political boundaries. But they, this group, we know them today as like the Knights of the Round Table. They were Templars, but a description of them from then was a Templar knight is truly a fearless knight and secure on every side, for his soul is protected by the armor of faith, just as his body is protected by the armor of steel. He is thus doubly armed and need fear neither demons nor man. And so that high-minded dedication to process and to their faith gave them great opportunities, and they amassed tremendous wealth. And as they grew, more and more recruits came into it. Their numbers exceeded over 10,000, and they became basically the largest military force in Europe. And under their control or under their protection, the peasants enjoyed more freedom than from what they had with the local kings. Now, they grew to be involved in banking. They developed the first traveler's checks to where pilgrims from, say, France wanted to go to the Holy Land. They would buy these paper checks that would then leave their money behind. And when they got to Jerusalem, the knights on the other end would cash it out and give them cash. So it was safe from being robbed on the way. Of course, their protection along the way was through the Templars. They eventually had over 9,000 tracts of land. They had a whole fleet of ships, and they became extremely powerful. These people, the Knights Templar, were really the original political freedom fighters as we know of freedom today. And they got to be so wealthy that the different kings and even the church borrowed money from them. When the time came to pay them back, they couldn't. And so the solution for, say, example, King Philip and the Pope then decided it was easier to just have them captured and tortured and killed, and then their problem with their debts solved. And that they did on Friday the 13th, 1307. And this persecution of the Templars continued for years. And finally, in March of 1314, the Grand Master Jacques de Molay was forced to plead guilty to some kind of confession that he was an infidel or he was a heretic, and therefore, when he recanted this later on, they burned him at the stake. And while he's in this smoldering mess, they use green woods to make the pain endure even longer rather than hot fires. He proclaimed that before the end of the year, French King Philip and Pope Clement would die. So his prophecy actually came true. Before the end of the year, they both died of natural causes. Part of what supposedly the Templars had done was to carry some of the treasures from King Solomon's temple, even as far away as into Scotland. We hear the stories of Rosslyn Chapel, and the Templars also were supposedly the ones that were carried the Shroud of Turin from Constantinople after its fall. Interestingly, the accusations of heresy came because the Templars would worship the Shroud of Turin as the burial cloth of Christ, and because of that, the church said that it was heresy. So very interesting. The Shroud of Turin exists even to this day, and yet is to be fully explained. But it just shows you the lineage of these relics that the Templars had saved. So after the disbursement of the Templars, and of course, then right became wrong, and they're back into chaos and trouble again, and the exertion of political force over people. So during all these battles back and forth, there was one significant political development in 1215. That was when King John of England was facing near certain defeat of his army at Runnymede. He agreed to recognize the unwritten rights of man, and so it was the first time that a written promise was made to the peasants that he would share some of his authority with his subjects. So now, after the medieval warming period, here's how climate plays in all this as well. There was a little ice age began in about 1300, and this caused a lot of the glaciers moving south into the latitudes. And incidentally, Greenland was named Greenland, even though it's covered with ice today, at the time of the medieval warming period. So it was green at one time. But the advancement of ice in the ice ages had a tremendous and profound effect on the political economy of Northern Europe, because of course, you couldn't grow food like you could, above the grounds, as they were accustomed to finding for sources of their food. And survival became much different than what it had been during the warming period. But in clustering them all together, there was an outbreak in the 1330s of the bubonic plague, and it first came from China, but it devastated the population of Europe, taking about 1/3 of its population, which was an estimated 25 million people that were died of the Black Plague. And with this, all that we can sort of understand plagues today or pandemics today, and the kinds of struggles we've had, but just imagine what it was without the intervention of government and all the things that we've seen happen here in America. But there was rioting and there was plundering, and of course the hierarchy of the political hierarchy was turned upside down. And the religious leaders were at loss because they said their prayers weren't being answered. So people began to rethink of what they were being told by religious leaders. But then just as mysteriously as the Black Plague appeared, it disappeared. But the decades of disease and famine and war really sort of turned everything upside down. Anarchy reigned supreme. Now, go back to the Templars. In Spain, there was the Sephardic Jews who were basically the neo-messianics. So they were the followers of Christ. They were moved to Spain after the Romans had destroyed Jerusalem. And while they were there, they were very productive and growing. And along came the Catholic Church, and it decided that it was the way for everything. And so the neo-messianics were then considered to be heretics again, because they didn't follow all the rules of the Catholic Church, and they began to be persecuted. And because they were heretics, if you will, their heresy was they didn't agree with the Church's rules, which at the time was much different than what we know today, and did often change. They were either imprisoned and languished until they died, and their property was stolen, or they were executed with a slow burn at the stake. So it was not a pretty thing. So when it came time for Christopher Columbus to come along, he was a member of the Knights of Christ. Now, his father-in-law was a master in what had become the remnant of the Templars in Portugal. And Christopher Columbus, which was not his real name, by the way, his father was a nobleman, but his mother was Jewish. And because she was Jewish, he was threatened, or he was thought of that he may lose everything he had and end up in prison and all of his property stolen, just as that happened to so many other people who were Jewish at the time. So he changed his name to his last name to that of what his wife had, and therefore sort of hid the big secret. But because he had been the son of a nobleman, he had the opportunities to learn from the greatest navigators of the time. And when it came time for him to dream about crossing the Atlantic. It was that great knowledge that he gained through his father's influence that gave him the idea about going west to the Indies to further the gospel, if you will. Now, because the Jews were being persecuted, and anybody who didn't follow with the Catholic Church, including the Messianic Christians, they needed to get out of there fast, because October 31st, 1492 was the deadline. Either you get out or you're going to, we're going to take your money, or we're going to throw you in jail. So off they went with the three ships, Columbus's three ships, and you can see that he was a Templar. If you see the sails that they had with the Red Cross on it, that was a sign of the Templars. But they left on the very last day, the Neta Pinta and the Santa Maria, and at the very day that Queen Isabella ordered all the Jews to leave Spain. Incidentally, today in Portugal, there are tremendous architectural feats and buildings and tunnels and things that go back to the Templars that are there for anyone to explore even today. So Columbus came over here with this fleet of three, largely funded by the Neo-Messianics and people trying to flee the persecution of the Grand Inquisitors in Spain. So here they came and found the New World. And later on, those Neo-Messianics and Messianics who came with Columbus, they became the foundation of the Pirates of the Caribbean that we know today. And they hated the Spanish so much. So this is why there was all these ratings. But that's another story. I'll get back to that another time. But there was a shift in the political thought when all this was going on, because of the failure of the hierarchy to walk the talk on matters of faith. The king in England, King James III, he got tired of hearing these different theories about what is the proper theology instead. So he ordered the translation of the scriptures from the Latin, at that time Latin, which came from Greek, which came from Hebrew. He ordered it to be changed so that, and at the time when the printing press, Gutenberg's printing press happened to be about, so they started to print these things out in large numbers. And all of a sudden now, anybody who knew how to read could go and compare what they read, what they were being told by the church, to see who was right. And that King James version, the translation, led to people thinking about, well, how should government be structured? I mean, if the kingdom of God is such, then how should the kingdom of man be? And it's from those early ideas about how we should be governed by secular laws, started to grow some from a little seed into larger ideas about challenging the authorities of the supreme authorities of the countries. So the idea that the kings themselves would rule as the divine right of kings, and claiming that their ancestry goes back to Adam, and God gave Adam the dominion over the earth, so therefore they were descendants of Adam, and then they should be able to have the same power to say they have dominion over the earth. But after a while, people realized that everybody goes back to Adam, so that sort of blew up that theory. But in 1644, Samuel Rutherford wrote The Law and the Prince. And he argued that men's law of governing society should be based upon the scriptures, rather than a forever changing ideas of men and influence of individuals. And so he held that all people were held under the law, and they could not exempt themselves from the sovereignty of the law. And this solved an age-old problem of absolute sovereignty, you see, because the idea that we are all equally short, or fallen short under the perfection of God, meant that since we're all equally imperfect, then we are all equal. That's really where the idea of equality comes from. It's not that we're supposed to have equal stuff, but it's because we're all fallen short. But that was a basis of a political thought. The basic concept of America is that we're all created equal, right? So the idea goes back into the 1600s. So when right was might, then people would be free. That was the idea that he was trying to project. But at the same time, another guy came along. His name was Thomas Hobbes, and he was the author of Leviathan. And this was written a little later, 1651. And of course, we know the word Leviathan means a huge beast. So, and that describes what he felt was needed to keep everything in order, because you have to have this huge bureaucracy or this huge army or whatever to just sort of pound everybody into the kind of order that would maintain some sort of order for whoever's advantage. And this came out as a result after the reign of King Henry VIII. And we know Henry VIII did. He had a power play with the Catholic Church. He declared himself. They had control of the Church of England and the Anglicans and all that sort of thing. And but Hobbes insisted the government should control everything in order to maintain effective order. So this idea of the beast is then introduced. But he said that the tendencies of our natural tendencies is to do unto others before they do unto you, and because he considered life to be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Nice guy, huh? With this in mind, he went on to write that his primary goal was to propose the acceptance of an absolute power as a cure for civil war, crimes, and other social behaviors. But the question becomes, in his mind at least, in his writings, he said, well, who's to determine what the law is? By what standard will it be administered? So he said that that every subject whose rules which the Commonwealth hath commanded him by word, writing, or other sufficient sign of the will to make use of for the distinction of rights and wrongs. But it's clear then that we have that if the civil laws proposed by Hobbes were to be at the discretion of man, they would conflict with the moral laws of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and particularly the Messianics. So what we would expect is that Hobbes really detested the influence of religion in his full perfect world. And he wrote, foreseeing the ghostly power challenged the right to declare what is sin, it challenged by consequence to declare what is law, unquote. So you can see the paradox here. So off this went, and he also considered the family to be an extension of the heavy-handed use of authority, and recommended replacing the natural authority of father and mother with the authority of the state. Boy, doesn't that sound true today, huh? Okay. He contributed, though. He did make make good points here. One is that he developed the idea of individual liberty because he created the notion of placing the ultimate social power of government's legal framework to put it into the context of laws rather than the ever-changing minds of kings. Recall that, whatever the king said was the law. So if he decided one day he didn't like this law, he'd just make a new one, and it was the law of the land. So he could see the idea of the general will of the people. So it's like the public interest we call it today, or the majority, or the Democrat kind of way of reasoning. But at the same time, we also had John Locke came around 1689, and he had written a number of pieces on government, but his second treatise on government was, he really built the case for political leadership based on the consent of the governed, by meticulously referring to basically where most high-minded thought came from, which was the scriptures. And he built the idea that the rights of citizens to life, liberty, and property were a fundamental gift from God himself, and that the moral foundations of civil and criminal laws should arise from basically the good of the community. So if you look at chapter 2, the state of nature, Locke wrote that to understand, chapter 2, section 4, to understand, quote, to understand political right and derive it from the original, we must consider what state will men naturally be in, and that is a state of perfect freedom in order to their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of other men. I'm not going to go into any further discussion on this because it's pretty, of course, they wrote much differently than we do today, but let me just say this is in chapter 2, section 6. Although this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license. Though man in the state have an uncontrollable liberty to dispose of his persons or possessions, yet he has not liberty to destroy himself so much as any creature in his possession, but where some nobler use of its bare preservation calls for it. End of quote. So John Locke was very influential later on with our founders, and much of his ideas were carried forth. But the idea of a sovereign law as a supreme authority of government was really another step towards our political liberties as we know them. But along came Rousseau. Now, he was an 18th century guy, a Frenchman, who was one of the leading figures of the French Enlightenment. And in 1762, he wrote Social Contracts, where he put forth the idea of the general will as the ultimate expression of a community's people. And basically what it was that Vox Populi, Vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. So the majority of people saying one thing has to be the voice of God, and that gave it the authenticity. But what they didn't know is that, majorities can be dead wrong. And that certainly found its way into the what eventually, when it was tried through the French Revolution, we know how that worked out. But he had his thoughts were that people could not be free to discuss their ideas and laws until the rigors of life were removed by a powerful central government. So this was during the Enlightenment. Of course, the French thought of many different things. They wanted to change the week to 10 days instead of 7. And they wanted to get rid of Sundays. They were going to get rid of religion. They would get rid of all kinds of things. So they were turning basically all the ideas of the country upside down. And of course, Rousseau detested the power of the Catholic Church, or Christian Church in France. It was Catholic, because he could not convince the followers of the Church of Christ with their new ideas concerning how things would be. As an example, the 7-day week being changed for a 10-day week to a decimal system of sorts. And in this discussion, he claimed that the Christian commitment to their faith was a major obstacle committing the allegiance of the people to the state. And he wrote that, quote, each citizen would be completely independent of his fellow man and absolute dependent on the state, which operation is always brought by the same means, for it is only by the force of the state that the liberty of its members can be secured. End of quote. So there you have it. We're back to this old thing in Aristotle and Plato. You see, who's going to be in control? All right, so he went on to say that the parents should not be permitted to educate their children because a father's prejudices would interfere with the development of good citizens. And he wrote, should the public authority, in assuming the place of the father and charging itself with this important function, acquire his rights in the discharge of his duties, he should have little charge to protest, for he would only be altering his title, and that would have in common and under the name citizen the same authority over his children that he was exercising separately under the name of the Father, and would be no less obeying when speaking in the nature of the law than was spoken out of nature. Now, if you can understand that, you're pretty sharp, because this is the way they reasoned those days. No wonder they were confused. But here the point was that children were to be conformed to the outlook of the majority of the people. It was also always the majority. This is the idea where democracy comes from. Demo means people, and democracy means government. So people, government's people. But essentially what it is, it's mob rule. And we saw what happened with the French Revolution whenever there were shortages because the weather and armies stomping over all the food that was grown above the earth. The hunger led them to political upheaval, and eventually led to the guillotining of King Louis XVI. But prior to all of this, there's another interesting side note. Columbus, when he brought goods back from South America, included were things such as potatoes. And those potatoes were grown underground. Now, that was his food source that's protected from weather and armies. And King Louis wanted to get people to get eating potatoes. And Marie Antoinette used to wear potato flowers in her hair as a sign that it should be fashionable to eat potatoes. But the Catholic Church says the potatoes are underground, therefore they are of the devil and they should be avoided. Well, the king tried to get people to encourage it by creating this little plot of land that says the farmers are not allowed to go in there. He made it seem like there was something secret happening in there. And at the same time, he told the guards, let them go in and peek around a little bit. So when the farmers saw that there was this food crop coming out, there was actually something that was good for them. Then it started to grow, and the widespread planting of potatoes followed, in spite of what the Catholic Church said about it being demonic. But it was enough in time to prevent the French Revolution from executing the king, and And of course, we know what happened with the French Revolution as compared to our own. It was the whole concept of rolling by this group of mobsters that eventually, the most famous saying was, when facing the guillotine, the most famous saying was, "But I'm on your side." In other words, he turned against everyone. And this is a tribute to the failed philosophy of do as thou wilt, so do what you want to do. So liberty without boundaries, you see here, can lead to chaos and destruction and even, the collapse of a society. So that sort of brings us up to date. And I hope you enjoyed this series today. I threw a couple little other things in there as we were going. But next week, we'll hit the next chapter where we start to talk about all of this in the new world. So again, Dr. Bill Chovy calling on the podcast here, discussing liberty in America, past, present, and future. And I hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you.